In 1995, the United States Secret Service fed a stack of documents into a destruction bin. The documents covered presidential protection surveys from the fall of 1963, the exact weeks before John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, and they destroyed them just after a federal board, created by law to preserve every record of the assassination, had asked agencies to hand everything over. 32 years after the shooting, and someone still thought those papers needed to disappear. That's the real story of the Kennedy assassination, not just what happened in Dealey Plaza on November the 22nd, 1963, but what happened to the paper trail afterward. For 60 years, a majority of Americans have told pollsters the same thing. They do not believe their government told them the truth about the murder of their own president. Not a fringe, not a corner of the internet, a majority, decade after decade. Tonight we're going to walk through why, the official story and where it cracked, the man who was arrested and the man who silenced him on live television, the suspects people keep coming back to, the CIA, the mob, and the government itself, and the files. 60 years of locked files, including the massive releases of 2025 and 2026, what they finally showed and what they still don't. And there's one name you need to hold on to, a CIA officer almost nobody has heard of, a man whose records the agency fought to keep sealed for decades, even after he was dead. His name was George Joannides. Remember it, because by the end of this, that one name will explain more about why the doubt never died than any bullet ever could. Let's start with the story the government told. Here is what the government concluded, stripped of all the legal language. 10 months after the assassination, in September 1964, the Warren Commission, a panel led by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, delivered its report. It said one man did this. Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old former Marine, fired 3 shots from a 6th-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository, where he worked. 1 shot missed. 1 passed through Kennedy's neck and went on to wound Texas Governor John Connally, sitting in front of him. 1 struck the president in the head and killed him. No accomplices. No foreign plot, no American plot. 1 angry, unstable man with a mail-order rifle. And 2 days later, when Oswald himself was murdered, the commission said his killer acted alone too. 2 lone gunmen, back to back. No connection. Case closed. That was the official position of the United States government. In many ways, it still is. But the cracks showed almost immediately. And they didn't start with wild theories. They started with a stopwatch and a home movie. A Dallas dressmaker named Abraham Zapruder had filmed the motorcade with his personal camera. His film caught the entire shooting, every frame time-stamped by the speed of the camera itself. When investigators lined up the film against the shots, they hit a problem. The wounds to Kennedy and Connally appeared to happen too close together for 1 bolt-action rifle to fire, reload, aim, and fire again. The commission's answer became the most argued-over idea in the whole case. If Oswald acted alone, then a single bullet had to pass through Kennedy's neck, then hit Connally's back, exit his chest, shatter his wrist, and lodge in his thigh. 7 wounds. 2 men. 1 bullet. A bullet later found on a hospital stretcher in remarkably clean condition. Supporters called it the single bullet theory. Everyone else called it the magic bullet. To be fair to the official side, modern recreations and ballistics work have shown the bullet's path is physically possible, and serious investigators still defend it. But that's the point. 60 years on, they still have to defend it. For millions of ordinary Americans watching in the 1960s, the idea simply failed the smell test. And once one piece of the story felt forced, people started pulling at every other thread. There was the film itself, which the public wasn't allowed to see in motion for 12 years. When it finally aired on national television in 1975, viewers watched Kennedy's head snap backward, which, to the naked eye, looked like a shot from the front, not from Oswald's window behind him. Experts argued there are physical explanations for that movement, and there are. But the government had sat on the footage for over a decade, so when people finally saw it, they didn't just ask what it showed. They asked why it had been kept from them. By 1966, less than 3 years after Dallas, polls already showed most Americans doubted the lone gunman's story. The doubt was mainstream before the first conspiracy book hit the bestseller list. And then came the crack the doubters didn't create, the one the government created for them. In 1979, a committee of the United States Congress, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, reinvestigated the case and put a stunning sentence into the official record. Kennedy was probably killed as the result of a conspiracy. Probably a conspiracy. That finding leaned heavily on an acoustics recording that scientists later challenged, and the committee still named Oswald as the shooter. But think about what happened there. The American government investigated itself twice and got 2 different answers. So which answer do you trust? Well, that depends on what you make of the man at the center of it. Because Oswald only spent about 48 hours in custody. And in those 48 hours, he said one sentence into the news cameras that has echoed for 60 years, "I'm just a patsy." 2 days later, he was dead. To understand why people doubt the lone gunman story, you have to look at the gunman. Because Lee Harvey Oswald was not a nobody. That's the problem. His life reads like a spy novel, and nobody has ever fully explained it. At 17, he joins the Marines and is trained as a radar operator at a base in Japan that supported the U-2, America's top-secret spy plane. Then, at 19, this Marine defects to the Soviet Union. In the middle of the Cold War, he walks into the American embassy in Moscow and announces he'll give the Soviets everything he knows. Now here's where it gets strange. After nearly 3 years, Oswald changes his mind and comes home with a Russian wife. And the country he betrayed barely blinks. No prosecution, no lengthy interrogation that we know of. The State Department even helps arrange money for his travel. A defector to the enemy, welcomed back with paperwork. Was that just Cold War bureaucracy being sloppy? Maybe. There's no hard proof Oswald was working for any American agency, and mainstream historians will tell you the file supports a troubled loner, not an agent. But you can see why researchers have never let this go. Intelligence agencies were watching Oswald for years. The FBI had a file on him. The CIA tracked his movements. And yet officially, nobody was handling him. He was, somehow, both closely watched and completely unattached. In 1963, he surfaces in New Orleans, handing out leaflets for a pro-Castro group called Fair Play for Cuba. A one-man chapter, membership Oswald. He gets into a street scuffle with anti-Castro Cuban exiles, gets arrested, and even ends up debating on local radio. Hold on to that little New Orleans episode. It seems minor. It is not. Weeks before Dallas, he travels to Mexico City and visits both the Cuban and Soviet embassies, buildings the CIA had wired, photographed, and bugged. The agency was recording who came and went, which means the CIA knew about Oswald's contacts with communist governments weeks before the assassination. And after the shooting, it was remarkably vague with investigators about exactly what it knew and when. We'll come back to that, too. Then, November 22nd, Kennedy is shot. Within 90 minutes, Oswald is arrested in a movie theater, charged first with killing a Dallas police officer, then with killing the president. He denies everything. He asks for a lawyer. He tells reporters he's a patsy, a fall guy set up to. take the blame. Whatever the truth was, it was locked inside that man's head. And America was about to watch that head get destroyed on live television. Sunday morning, November 24th. Oswald is being walked through the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters for a routine transfer. The room is packed with reporters and cameras broadcasting live. A heavy-set man in a fedora steps out of the crowd, presses a revolver into Oswald's stomach, and fires. The first murder ever broadcast live on American television. The most important suspect in American history, dead before he could stand trial, dead before anyone could test his story, dead inside a police station surrounded by armed officers. The shooter was Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner. The official finding? A distraught, unstable man who loved Kennedy and acted on impulse. But Ruby was not a random grieving citizen. He was a man with documented connections to organized crime figures, a man who knew half the cops in Dallas, a man who had somehow walked into a secured police basement at the exact right moment. And here's what did more damage to public trust than any theory ever could. You didn't need a book or a researcher to explain it to you. Every American watching their television that Sunday morning did the math themselves. The one man who knew the truth was just permanently silenced. Later, from his jail cell, Ruby told reporters that the full story would never come out and asked to be taken to Washington to talk, a request that never happened. He died in prison in 1967 of cancer before his retrial. The official story asks you to accept a chain of coincidence. A lone gunman kills the president, and then a second lone gunman, a nightclub operator with mob acquaintances, kills the first gunman out of pure grief before any trial can happen. Millions of Americans looked at that and asked one question, the question that opens every theory we're about to walk through. If Oswald was silenced, who needed him silent? Over 60 years, the doubt has organized itself around a few main suspects. None of these theories has ever been proven. Let's say that plainly right at the top. But each one persists for a reason. Each one is fed by real documents, real motives, and real behavior. Let's take them one at a time. Suspect 1, the CIA. The motive theory goes like this. In 1961, the CIA led the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, and it failed humiliatingly. Kennedy publicly took the blame, but privately he was furious, and he forced out the agency's legendary director, Allen Dulles. Kennedy was reported to have said he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. In 1963, he was exploring quiet back channels toward peace with the Soviets, and even feelers toward Castro's Cuba. To cold warriors who believed they were fighting for civilization itself, the theory says, Kennedy looked less like a president and more like a threat. Is there hard evidence the CIA killed Kennedy? No, there is not. But here's what feeds the theory, and it's not imaginary. The CIA repeatedly lied about this case. It hid its surveillance of Oswald in Mexico City. It hid its assassination plots against Castro from the Warren Commission, plots that were obviously relevant to a murdered president's investigation. And decades later, it was still concealing things, which brings us back to that name from the beginning. But not yet. One thing at a time. Suspect 2, the Mafia. This is the theory that even sober investigators have struggled to dismiss. The motive is simple. The Kennedys declared war on organized crime. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, went after mob bosses with a fury the government had never shown before. Men like Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, who was literally grabbed by federal agents and deported, and Santo Traficante of Florida. Multiple witnesses later claimed both men had talked about wanting Kennedy dead. Claims that were never corroborated in court. Add Jack Ruby's underworld contacts, And you can see why the congressional investigation in 1979 pointed at organized crime as having the motive, means, and opportunity, while admitting it couldn't prove the mob actually did it. Suspect 3, Cuba, from both directions. Some believed Castro struck first, since the CIA was trying to kill him. Lyndon Johnson himself privately entertained that idea for the rest of his life. Others flipped it. Anti-Castro Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, who felt Kennedy had betrayed them at the Bay of Pigs and abandoned them after the missile crisis. Men with military training, burning grievance, and, this is the key, direct working relationships with American intelligence officers. Remember Oswald's strange street theater with anti-Castro exiles in New Orleans? That's the world it touched. And Suspect 4, the darkest version, the government itself. Elements of it, anyway. This theory says the assassination was, in effect, an inside removal. That people inside American power decided Kennedy was too dangerous to national security to leave in office, and that Vice President Johnson either knew, benefited, or looked away. There has never been credible evidence that Johnson was involved, and it's only fair to say most historians consider that version the weakest of all. But polls have shown startling numbers of. Americans over the years have suspected exactly that. Now step back and look at all 4 suspects together. Notice something? They all knew each other. The CIA hired the Mafia to kill Castro. That is not a theory. That is documented, admitted fact, confirmed by Senate investigators in the 1970s. The exiles worked for the CIA. The mob ran casinos in Cuba and wanted them back. Every suspect on the board was already tangled with the others in a real, secret, violent underworld, the covert war against Castro. And standing at the crossroads of that exact world, in the summer of 1963, handing out leaflets in New Orleans, was Lee Harvey Oswald. So even without proof of who pulled a trigger, Americans could see this much. Their government was running a secret world. The accused assassin had brushed against it. And after the murder, the government's overwhelming instinct was not to open that world up. It was to seal it. Whatever you believe about the shooting, this part is not a theory. The concealment happened. It's documented, admitted. And in some cases, the government destroyed evidence with its own hands. Start in the first week. Oswald, it turned out, had visited the Dallas FBI office days before the assassination and left a note for an agent named James Hosty. After Oswald was killed, Hosty was ordered by a superior to destroy that note. And he did, tearing it up and flushing it away. The FBI then hid that destruction from investigators for 12 years. Think about that. Physical evidence, written by the accused assassin, destroyed inside the FBI. Whatever the note said, and Hosty later claimed it was merely a complaint, the American people were never allowed to know. The autopsy was a mess of irregularities, performed by military doctors under pressure, with the president's brain and key materials later unaccounted for. The Warren Commission never saw the CIA's Castro assassination plots, and one member of that commission, quietly steering what the panel learned about the agency, was Allen Dulles, the very CIA director Kennedy had fired. Then came the vault. Millions of pages of assassination records were classified, some scheduled to stay sealed deep into the 21st century. The wall finally cracked in the early 1990s. And here's the strange part, because of a movie. Oliver Stone's film JFK ended with a note telling audiences the files were sealed. And the public reaction was so fierce that Congress passed a law in 1992, unanimously, ordering nearly everything released within 25 years. It created a review board to hunt down every record. That's the board the Secret Service defied in 1995 when it destroyed those protection surveys from the Weeks. Before Dallas, the story we opened with. The 25-year deadline landed in 2017. It came and went. President Trump, in his first term, released some files but held thousands back at the request of the intelligence agencies. President Biden did the same. Each delay came stamped with the same explanation: national security, and each delay for millions of Americans translated into 3 words: still hiding something. Then in January 2025, an executive order directed the release of everything left. On March 18, 2025, the National Archives began publishing the remaining withheld records, a release the administration described as roughly 80,000 pages, with more batches that spring. And it didn't end there. As recently as January 2026, the archives put out another 11,000 pages. After 62 years, the vault was finally mostly open. So, what was in it? Here's the honest answer, and it cuts both ways. There was no smoking gun, no memo ordering the president's death, no confession, nothing that overturned the conclusion that Oswald fired the shots. If you were waiting for a single page that proves the government killed Kennedy, it was not in those boxes. But if the files didn't prove a murder plot, they absolutely proved a lying habit. The releases laid bare, in full, the machinery the agency had spent decades blurring, the scale of CIA covert operations around the world in 1963, sabotage campaigns against Cuba running, month after month regime change work across Latin America, surveillance programs that reached inside the United States itself. They filled in how closely the agency's systems had tracked Oswald before the assassination, while it spent the following decades minimizing what it knew, piece after piece, that officials once swore was too dangerous for the public turned out to be mostly protection of the agency's own reputation and methods. And that leaves us with the question that keeps this story alive better than any theory ever could. If there was no proof of murder in those files, why did it take 62 years, an act of Congress, and orders from multiple presidents to pry them loose? Because here's what the government seems to have never understood. Every year of secrecy was itself evidence, not of a killing, but of the one thing that makes people believe in killings, that they were not being told the truth. Presidents have been assassinated before: Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley. In each case, the country grieved, punished, and moved on. Nobody's grandfather went to his grave arguing about who really shot McKinley. So, why this one? Why does this single event 60 years later still divide Americans against their own government? A few honest reasons. First, the story never balanced. A president is the most powerful man on earth, and the official answer says he was erased by an unemployed 24-year-old with a $21 mail-order rifle who was himself erased 48 hours later by a nightclub owner. Human beings struggle to accept that something so enormous can have a cause so small. Psychologists have a name for that instinct, and skeptics of the theories lean on it. But instinct alone doesn't explain 60 years. What explains 60 years is what came next. Because the second reason is this: the years after Dallas taught Americans that their government did lie. Not maybe, not allegedly. Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers proving officials knew the war was failing while saying otherwise. Watergate and a president resigning over a cover-up. The Church Committee in 1975 dragging the CIA's actual secrets into daylight. Assassination plots, mind control experiments, illegal spying on Americans, and files destroyed to hide it. Every one of those revelations retroactively rewrote 1963. Americans who had accepted the Warren Report in good faith looked back and asked the only rational question: if they lied about all that, why would I trust them about Dallas? The Kennedy doubt didn't grow because Americans became paranoid. It grew because their suspicion kept getting receipts. Third, the government never even agreed with itself. One official body said lone gunman. A second official body said probable conspiracy. When the state hands you two verdicts, choosing to doubt one of them isn't a conspiracy theory. It's arithmetic. And now, that name, George Joannides. Time to pay it off. In 1963, Joannides was a CIA officer in Miami. His job included secretly funding and guiding an anti-Castro exile group, the very group whose members clashed with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans that summer, the street fight and radio debate we flagged in. Chapter 2. That confrontation put pro-Castro Oswald into the public record months before Dallas, so a CIA officer was running the organization that helped brand the future accused assassin. Did that mean anything sinister? Unknown. But surely investigators should have been told. They weren't. It gets worse. In 1978, when Congress reopened the case, the CIA needed a liaison officer to assist the investigation, to fetch files, to answer questions. The man the agency chose for that job was George Joannides, the same officer from Miami, and the agency never told the committee who he really was. The committee's own investigators only learned the truth decades later, and the lead staff counsel publicly called it what it looks like: obstruction. The CIA then fought in federal court for years, into the 2000s and beyond, to keep Joannides' files sealed, long after the man himself was dead. Only with the releases of 2025 did researchers finally see confirmation of how he'd operated, including that he worked with the exile group under a false name. One officer, one file. And it contains the entire answer to tonight's question in miniature. Because whatever the truth of Dealey Plaza, the government's handling of George Joannides proves the thing Americans suspected all along. When the state investigated the murder of its own president, parts of the state were working the other side of the table. That's why the doubt never died. Not because Americans love a mystery, because at every single opportunity to earn back trust, 1964, 1975, 1979, 1995, 2017, the institutions chose concealment first and candor last. The belief that the government killed Kennedy may never be proven. But the belief that the government deceived the public about Kennedy doesn't need to be proven anymore. It's confirmed in its own files, in its own handwriting. So here is my honest take after everything we've walked through tonight. I don't think the endurance of this belief is really about ballistics or trajectories or acoustics. I think Americans believe the government killed Kennedy because the government behaved for 60 straight years exactly the way a guilty man behaves, hiding papers, destroying notes, planting its own officer inside the investigation, and releasing the truth only when forced, one pried finger at a time. Whether or not anyone in Washington was guilty of the murder, they were provably guilty of the concealment, and people judged. The crime by the cover-up. That's not paranoia. That's how trust works. Once broken this publicly, this repeatedly, it does not repair. It gets inherited, handed down from parents to children, like a family story. The assassination killed a president. The secrecy killed something bigger. The assumption that your government, in the end, will level with you. So let me leave you with this. And I want real answers in the comments, not a shrug. The files are open now. No smoking gun was in them. So pick a side and tell me plainly, does the 2025 release settle it for you? Oswald alone? Case closed? Or do you believe the most important pages never made it into the boxes at all? One or the other. And if you were alive that November, or your parents were, tell me what your family believed at the dinner table, because that answer, more than any document, is the real record of this story. Same time next week, the archive is open.